I didn't go back for the rehearsal dinner or the speeches. I went back because my mother finally said the quiet part loud, right in front of everyone who mattered to her. "What exactly are you doing here? You work in a bank." She said it like a punchline. Like my job was a consolation prize she was reminding the room about. The laughter that followed was the kind people make when they're not sure if something was a joke. My father looked at his bread roll. My sister's fiancé went the color of old chalk. Not because of the insult, because he recognized me. Not as her estranged older sister, as the loans officer whose name was on the file connected to his business application. But you can't understand that moment until you understand what they made me carry first. I was 22 when my parents explained to me, very gently, very finally, that they couldn't help with my university fees. We were in the kitchen of the house in Oakville. The kind of house that looks warm from the outside, brick, bay window, a wreath on the door at Christmas. Inside, it smelled like dryer sheets and unspoken things. I'd laid out the OSAT paperwork, the tuition invoice, the gap I needed covered. $3,800. I'd done the math so many times the numbers had started to feel like a physical weight I carried everywhere. My mother was making tea. She didn't stop making it. "We just can't swing it right now," she said. "You're smart. You'll figure it out." My father was at the table. He had the newspaper open, but he wasn't reading it. I could tell because he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. "Dad." He looked up. "Is there anything?" "Your mother's right," he said. "We're stretched." I nodded. I didn't cry. I'm not sure why. Maybe I already half knew. Maybe some part of me had been bracing for this since my sister was born and I watched the world tilt slightly in her direction and never quite tilt back. Her name was Brooke, younger by 4 years. She had an ease about her that I never did, with people, with rooms, with our parents. She didn't have to work for their attention. She just stood in it like sunlight. 6 weeks after that kitchen conversation, my parents bought her a car. Not a flashy one. A used Civic in good condition, gray, practical. My father said it was a safety thing. She was doing her driving lessons and the old car wasn't reliable. My mother wrapped a bow around the key fob. Actual ribbon. I was standing in the doorway of the garage watching this happen and nobody looked at me. Not once. I thought about the $3,800. About the paperwork still sitting in my room because I hadn't been able to bring myself to deal with it yet. I went back inside and sat on my bed and thought, okay, I understand now. Not everything, but enough. I spent that semester working 2 jobs. A coffee shop on campus from 6 to 10 in the morning, a grocery store 3 evenings a week, and all-day Saturdays. I learned to sleep in 4-hour windows. I ate a lot of peanut butter toast and marked the days off on a calendar like someone serving time. I made it through first year. Barely. My grades were acceptable, but not what they should have been, because I was exhausted in a way that goes underneath. Tired into something almost structural. By second year, I had a small bursary. By third year, I had a part-time position at the university's financial aid office, which paid a little better, and also, quietly, changed the direction of my life. I was good at the work. Not just the paperwork. The assessment, the judgment calls, looking at a financial picture and understanding what it actually said. My supervisor noticed. She encouraged me to look at banking when I graduated. The Royal Bank had a graduate program. I applied. I got in. I didn't tell my parents. Not from spite. Not exactly. More because I'd learned by then that telling them things too early gave them the chance to make my life smaller before it had the chance to become what it could be. My mother had a way of reducing things, calling them practical when she meant unimpressive, calling something a good start in a tone that meant she didn't think it would go anywhere. So I waited until I had something they couldn't shrink. The program placed me in a commercial banking stream, which is less glamorous than it sounds, and more consequential than most people realize. Small business lending, agricultural financing, commercial real estate. The work is a conversation between numbers and lives. People come in with ideas and plans and all the hope they've managed to keep alive through difficult years, and my job is to understand whether the numbers support what they're reaching for. I was 28 when I became a senior commercial lending officer. The title sounds bureaucratic. What it means, practically, is that my signature is on the documents that determine whether a business gets funded. My parents resurfaced around then. They always did, eventually. My mother called, her voice warm in that specific way it got when she wanted something, to say that Brooke's boyfriend was starting a restaurant. A lovely concept, she said. Farm to table. There was a space in Burlington. He just needed a small loan to bridge the gap between his investors and his build-out costs. That sounds like something to discuss with a bank, I said. A pause. Well, we thought, since you work in finance, I can give him the name of a good commercial officer at our Burlington branch, I said. The pause was longer this time. Don't be like that, my mother said. Her voice had changed. The warmth had dropped out of it the way heat drops out of a room when a door opens in winter. We're family. That word. The way she used it only ever moved in one direction. I told her I'd send the contact information. I did. I heard nothing more about it for over a year. By year 6, I'd moved into a specialized role that most people outside the industry don't know exists. Risk and compliance review for mid-market commercial clients. The short version is that my team assesses files that have complexity, conflicts of interest, unusual structures, applications that require a second layer of scrutiny before approval. It's not investigative work, it's methodical. It's documentation and judgment, and an almost surgical attention to what a file actually says versus what it's presenting itself as. My manager, Teresa, called me the reader. She meant I could look at a financial application and see the story under the story. I was 30 when Brooke announced her engagement on Instagram. I saw it the way you see most things about people you've drifted from, sideways while scrolling through something else. A photo. Her hand extended, ring catching light, his arm around her shoulder. She looked happy. I felt something complicated and quiet that I didn't examine too closely. His name was Kyle. I didn't know much about him until his file crossed my desk 3 weeks later. Not because of the engagement, because he'd applied for a significant commercial loan through our branch network, an expansion of a restaurant concept in Burlington, applying now for a second location in Hamilton. The file had been flagged for secondary review because of some inconsistencies in the declared equity structure. Routine, at that stage. Just a flag. I pulled the file. Same Kyle. Same birth date. Same first restaurant. The one my mother had called me about 4 years ago. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I read the file properly. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic. They weren't fraud. Not obviously. But there was a structure in his investor documentation that was irregular, a declared silent partner whose contribution amount shifted between 2 versions of the same document, the kind of thing that could be a filing error, the kind of thing that also could be something else. In my world, the difference between those 2 possibilities requires scrutiny, not assumption. I flagged my conflict of interest to Teresa before I said anything else. My sister is engaged to this applicant, I said. I recognized the name. She studied me. You've already read the file. I pulled it before I made the connection. Once I recognized him, I stopped. She nodded slowly. You're recusing yourself. Yes, but the flag stands on its own. Someone else needs to work the inconsistency. Teresa reassigned the file. I documented the recusal. That was the end of my involvement professionally. The wedding invitation arrived the following month. Heavy cardstock. My parents' names at the bottom alongside Brooke's, listed as hosts. The venue was a restored heritage property outside of Hamilton, the kind of place my mother had always wanted for something. I hadn't been to their house in 3 years. I hadn't spoken to Brooke in longer than that. I hadn't planned to attend. But I was still technically connected to the review chain, even after recusal, which meant I had an ethical obligation to be transparent if my presence at a family event related to the applicant created any appearance issue. I spoke to Teresa again. She thought about it, said that attending a family event was not a compliance issue as long as I didn't discuss the file, which I had no intention of doing. You're allowed to go to your sister's wedding, she said, with a gentleness that made me realize how strange my life must look from the outside sometimes. I RSVP'd yes. The venue was everything my mother would have chosen. String lights over exposed timber beams, long tables with linen runners, locally sourced menu printed on craft paper. The aesthetic said effortless in a way that required a significant amount of money to achieve. I arrived in the dress I'd bought for a conference the previous year. Navy, simple, well cut. Not a statement, just clothes. My mother spotted me near the entrance. Her expression passed through several things before it settled on a kind of controlled displeasure dressed up as surprise. "You actually came," she said. "You invited me." Brooke was across the room with her bridal party. She looked beautiful in the way brides do when they're happy, which is its own particular kind of beauty. She saw me. Her face went uncertain, then something softer. She didn't come over right away. My father found me near the drinks table. He looked older, slower. He hugged me with a sincerity that surprised me, said he was glad I'd come. I believed him, which was its own complicated thing. Then Kyle saw me. I watched it happen from across the room. He was mid-conversation with someone, holding a glass of something sparkling, and then his eyes moved to me and his entire face changed. Not in the way faces change when you recognize someone from a long time ago. In the way faces change when a context you thought was contained suddenly becomes larger and more serious than you expected. He knew who I was, not as Brooke's sister, as the name on the initial review memo. He'd seen my name. He'd done the math. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother chose that moment. She'd been moving through the room doing the work she was always good at, directing attention, managing impressions. She came to stand beside me and scanned me with that particular look she had, the one that took inventory and found everything slightly lacking. "You know," she said loud enough, "it's funny. Brooke married into such an interesting world. Entrepreneurs, investors." A small smile. "What exactly are you doing here? You work in a bank." The laughter around us was the uneasy kind. A few people smiled without knowing why. My father looked at his drink. Kyle set down his glass. He crossed the room faster than I expected. His face was white in a way that had nothing to do with nerves about the ceremony. "Mom." His voice was tight. He wasn't looking at my mother. He was looking at me. She turned. "Kyle, I was just... Do you know who this is?" His voice had dropped into something low and precise. My mother blinked. "Of course. She works at RBC Commercial Lending." He said it like each word was a careful footstep. "Her name is on the review documentation connected to my Hamilton application." The space around us went quiet in a way that spreads outward from a specific kind of silence. My mother's expression folded into something uncomprehending. "I don't know what that means." "It means," Kyle said, and he was working very hard to keep his voice level, "that you just called the person connected to my business loan a bank teller. At our wedding, in front of people." "I didn't say." "You said she works in a bank like it was something embarrassing." His jaw was tight. "Do you understand what a commercial lending officer actually does?" Brooke appeared at his elbow. "Kyle, what's happening?" He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Apology, dread, the particular panic of realizing the floor has opened underneath a day you planned for a year. "We need to talk." Brooke looked at me. "What is going on?" "Nothing that needs to happen here," I said quietly. My mother's voice sharpened. "No. If there's something to say, say it." I looked at her for a moment. Old habit. Old assessment. "All right," I said. We moved to a sitting room off the main hall. Heavy curtains, 2 couches, a window looking out onto the property. My parents sat together. Brooke stood near the door. Kyle remained standing, jacket already a little undone, the day unraveling faster than he could process. He spoke first. Told Brooke, in careful, measured sentences, what he understood of the situation. That his loan application had been flagged, that I had been part of the review team before recusing myself, that he'd seen my name on documentation weeks ago and recognized the surname but hadn't been certain. That he was certain now. Brooke stared at him. "You knew and you didn't tell me." "I didn't know for sure, and I didn't know if it mattered." "Does it matter?" my mother asked. Her voice had the brittle quality it got when she was frightened. Kyle chose his words slowly. "The flag on the file exists independently of her. She recused. That's the right thing, ethically. But the inconsistency in my investor documents still needs to be resolved. My father, who had been silent, said, "Inconsistency." Kyle exhaled. "There's a discrepancy in how I reported one of my investor contributions across two versions of the application. It's probably a paperwork error. My accountant is handling it, but it needs to be cleared before the loan advances." Silence. Then my mother turned to me, and something about the way she looked at me, the calculation in it, the reflex toward making me responsible for a problem I hadn't created, made something shift in my chest that had been very still for a very long time. "You flagged it," she said. "I pulled the file before I knew the connection." "Yes. And then you came here. And then I recused myself, documented the conflict, and came to my sister's wedding." After causing a problem for her fiancé's business, the word "causing" sat in the room like something she'd dropped. I reached into my bag. I hadn't planned this, not exactly, but I had brought the documents because I'd been carrying them for years, in one form or another, and I thought, maybe on the drive here, maybe earlier, that if there was ever going to be a moment for the real conversation, it would have to be one where there was nowhere left to retreat to. I set a folder on the coffee table. My father's eyes went to it immediately. "What is that?" my mother said. Not a question, a warning. "My OSAP documentation from second year," I said. "And a letter from the university's financial aid office." Brooke looked confused. "Why?" "Because when I withdrew from my second semester due to non-payment," I said, "my eligibility for student aid was recalculated. Part of that recalculation was based on a declaration of parental financial support that had been submitted to the university." I looked at my father. He had gone the color of old paper. "Someone declared," I continued, voice still even, "that my parents were contributing to my education costs for that semester. They weren't. They told me directly they couldn't help. But the declaration was on file, which reduced my bursary eligibility and contributed to why I couldn't cover the gap," Brooke whispered. "What? I don't know if it was intentional," I said, and I meant that. I had spent years with that question and arrived at something more complicated than a clean answer. I think it may have been a form that was filled out incorrectly, or not corrected after circumstances changed. But the effect was that my financial aid was reduced during a semester I was struggling to survive, and nobody told me why. My mother's voice was a thread. "You can't seriously be, Mom." Brooke's voice cut across the room. Something about the way she said it made everyone stop. Brooke was looking at my mother with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not confusion. Not the soft worry she usually wore. Something harder and more awake. "Is that true?" she said. My mother opened her mouth. "Did you fill out a form saying you were supporting her when you weren't?" It wasn't like that. Was there a form? Not a question. The silence that followed was its own answer. My father rubbed his hand over his face. "There was a form," he said quietly. "From the university. Financial Circumstances Declaration. Your mother filled it out. I don't think she understood the implications." "I understood it was none of their business," my mother said, voice rigid. "It directly affected my funding," I said. "You dropped out anyway." "I dropped out because I couldn't afford to continue. The form made that harder to afford." Kyle sat down. He looked like someone trying to process two crises at the same time and not succeeding fully at either. Brooke sat beside him. She didn't look at my parents. She looked at her hands. "I got a car that year?" she said finally. Nobody answered. "I got a car, and you told the university you were paying her tuition." My mother's voice had lost its edge. What replaced it was something more uncertain and somehow harder to witness. "We did what we thought was right at the time." Brooke laughed once, without humor. "For who?" The question sat there. My father said, barely audible, "We should have talked to you. Back then. We should have found a way." I looked at him. The thing about my father was that he had always known when something was wrong. He just never found the cost of addressing it worth more than the cost of staying quiet. And for the first time I saw that this had exacted its own price from him. The years of not saying anything had not left him unburdened. They'd just changed what he was carrying. "I know," I said. "It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was just the truth of the moment. My mother sat very straight and said nothing else. There is a kind of person who reorganizes reality before they'll revise their version of themselves. She wasn't going to apologize. I had known that before I walked in. The point was never the apology. The point was that Brooke was sitting 5 feet away, hearing something she hadn't known, letting it be real. Kyle said my name. My last name. Professional reflex. He straightened slightly. I looked at him. The file review. That's separate from any of this. Completely, I said. I'm not involved. The flag exists because there's a discrepancy in your paperwork that needs to be resolved. That has nothing to do with me or this family. Get your accountant to clean up the documentation and resubmit the affected section. He nodded slowly. Some of the white had left his face. The review process is fair, I said. That's the whole point of it. He nodded again. And I think he understood what I was actually saying, not just about his file, but about the thing my mother had done with that word fair my whole life. How she'd used it when it suited her and discarded it when it didn't. The room stayed quiet for a while. Brooke was the first to move. She stood up, smoothed her dress. Her eyes were red at the rims, but she was holding herself carefully. She walked to where I was sitting and stood in front of me for a moment. I didn't know, she said. I know. I believed what they told me. That you just left. That you wanted to leave. I know. She sat down beside me. Not close, but not across the room either. Somewhere in the middle, which felt honest. I'm sorry, she said, for being the one they spent it on. That wasn't your fault, I said, and I meant it. She had been 17. She hadn't asked to be the favorite. Being loved more than someone else doesn't make you responsible for what that love cost the other person. Still, she said. Still, I agreed. The wedding continued. Of course it did. Events like that have their own momentum. The catering, the music, the guests who don't know anything has happened, the speeches that were written months ago. Life is remarkably good at continuing around the places where it is cracked. My mother moved through the reception performing a version of herself that was only slightly diminished. My father was quieter than he'd been in years. Kyle kept his composure at the ceremony and gave a speech that was warm and funny and only showed its seams if you knew where to look. Brooke danced with him and looked, genuinely, like someone trying to decide what happiness means when the context it existed in has changed shape. I left before the last dance. No exit speech. No scene. Just a coat and a drive back on the 403 in the dark with the radio on low. The file review concluded 6 weeks later. Kyle's accountant resubmitted the corrected investor documentation. The discrepancy was resolved as a filing error. The original contribution had been recorded against 2 different reporting periods by mistake. The loan advanced without issue. His Hamilton location opened the following spring. The financial aid declaration took longer to surface formally because these things move slowly when they move at all. The university's financial office confirmed the discrepancy when I submitted a formal inquiry. There were no criminal charges. The amounts involved and the murky question of intent made it a civil matter at most. There was a restitution process. My parents' lawyer handled it. My mother called it a misunderstanding the entire time. My father signed the forms in silence. I met him at a Tim Hortons off the QEW the following winter. He looked like a man who'd had something settled inside him, disturbed, and hadn't yet found a new equilibrium. He said he was sorry. I said I believed him. He asked what that meant, whether we were, and he didn't finish the sentence. It means I'm not interested in carrying this into the next decade, I said. But accountability and moving on aren't the same thing. Both have to happen. He nodded. He ordered a second coffee. We talked about ordinary things for another half hour. His garden, the winter so far, the strange year it had been. Conversation like 2 people learning a new language, slowly, without a good dictionary. Brooke called me a few months later. Kyle's restaurant was doing well. She'd started seeing a therapist, she said, which she offered as information and not as a bid for my approval. She was thinking about things differently, about what she'd been told versus what she'd seen, about the gap between those 2 versions of her family. I don't know how to fix it, she said. You don't have to fix it all at once, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? Like, actually. The question surprised me, not because it was strange, but because I realized no one had asked it in a very long time. I am, actually, I said. It took a while, but yes. She said that was good. She said it like she meant it. People sometimes ask if I regret going back. Whether the truth was worth the wreckage, whether it would have been cleaner to just continue, stay gone, build my life without the confrontation. The honest answer is that I didn't go back to make a scene. I went because Brooke was my sister, and whatever had happened between us had begun before either of us had any say in it. I went because I was tired of the version of my life that lived in their story. The dropout, the difficult one, the one who left. And I went because somewhere in me I still believed that truth, laid down quietly and completely, has a different gravity than silence. My mother still doesn't apologize. I'm not sure she's capable of it, or maybe she is and the cost is too high, and at some point the distinction stops mattering. She calls occasionally. The calls are careful, short, positioned at a safe distance from everything that happened. I pick up sometimes. My father sends texts now. Short ones. Nothing that asks too much. He sent one this past September just to say he'd seen a heron at the lake and thought it was something. I looked at it for a long time before I wrote back. As for me, I still work in lending. Different role now, broader scope. I still sit across tables from people with plans and paperwork and all the hope that takes to sustain. I still read the story under the story. And I still believe that the most important thing in any transaction, any relationship, any room, is whether the terms are actually what they say they are. My parents told me independence was a gift they were giving me. It wasn't. It was a cost they were passing on. I paid it, all of it, and then I learned what it was actually worth. Turns out, quite a lot. I've thought a lot about what my mother actually believed when she handed Brooke the car keys that Friday. I don't think she thought she was doing something wrong. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. Not the harm itself, but the complete absence of awareness around it. She thought she was being practical. She thought she was managing a family with limited resources and making sensible calls. She thought, genuinely, that I was the one who could handle it. What she didn't understand was that handling it has a cost. It costs years. It costs sleep and groceries and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching other people get caught when they fall while you learn, very quietly, that no net is coming for you. I didn't become a lending officer because of what happened to me. Or not only because of it, but I think the work found me partly because I understand, in a way that's hard to teach, what it means to be assessed on paper. To have your whole situation reduced to numbers and declarations, to be told the system says one thing when your life says another. I've sat across the table from enough people to know that the gap between what a file shows and what's actually true can be significant. My job is to close that gap with honesty, not to widen it with convenience. What my parents did, or what my mother did and my father allowed, was use the language of a system to tidy up a decision they'd already made. They'd chosen Brooke. The form just made it official in a way that had real consequences for me and no consequences for them. That's not malice necessarily, but it is a kind of moral laziness that compounds over time. Every small dishonesty that goes unexamined becomes the foundation for the next one. Kyle's file had a discrepancy that was almost certainly a paperwork error. Probably was, but the reason it mattered, the reason my team flags things like that, is because almost certainly isn't certainly, and in matters that affect people's futures, almost isn't good enough. You document, you verify, you hold the standard even when it's inconvenient, especially then. That's what my parents never did. Not with me, not with the university form, not with any of it. Brooke is doing something different now. I can see it in small ways. The questions she asks, the things she's willing to name out loud. She told me once that she used to assume the version of events she'd been given was just the truth. She didn't know there was a gap to look for. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when you've only ever been handed one version of a story by people you trust. The work of adulthood, for a lot of us, is learning to ask whose version you're living in. My father is learning that too. Slowly. He'll text me sometimes. Just ordinary things. Nothing that demands too much from either of us. I think he's trying to figure out how to be present without being forgiven, and how to earn something he's not sure he deserves yet. I respect that more than I expected to. What I know now, and what I didn't know at 22 sitting at that kitchen table with my paperwork laid out in a neat and hopeful row, is that integrity isn't something that pays off immediately. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds. Over years, through things you couldn't have predicted, it holds. And eventually the ground you built on turns out to matter more than anyone expected, including you.